Hello and welcome to today's webinar, Structuring Your Organization for Success with Data Analytics, brought to you by AuditNet and Arbutus. My name is Jim Kaplan. I'm the founder of AuditNet, and I will be moderating this event. Serving the global audit community, AuditNet is the primary online resource for auditors to share resources, tools, and experiences. AuditNet has been at the forefront of websites dedicated to promoting the use of audit technology and has now expanded its offering to include high-quality, web-based training for auditors and finance professionals. Arbutus has partnered with AuditNet to share presentations featuring the best practices of respected professionals in the audit community. I'm now pleased to introduce today's guest speaker, Michael Cano. Michael is a recent addition to the Arbutus software team. He has 25 years of experience in data analytics and internal audit with organizations in the USA, Canada, and the Middle East. He was a senior member of the data analytics practice at Focal Point Data Risk, a US-based professional services firm. Michael led eBay's data analytics program in the internal audit department, tasked with integrating data analytics into the audit workflow on strategic and tactical levels. This included training users and providing analytics support on numerous audits in the IT, PayPal, and eBay marketplace business areas. Michael supported audits throughout the organization in the IT, compliance, vendor management, revenue assurance, travel and entertainment, and human resources areas. His software experience includes Arbutus Analyzer, ACL Desktop Direct Link, Alteryx, Microsoft Access, SQL, and Tableau. Michael led ACL Services Global Training Team for 8 years. He's a graduate of the UCLA Anderson School of Management. So at this point, thank you, and I will now turn the floor over to Michael for structuring your organization for success with data analytics. Michael?
Thanks for the introduction, Jim. Hello, everyone. Very glad that you could all join us today. In my early days in data analytics, I often thought that it would be a simple matter for everyone to learn how to use the data analytics tools and then apply them in the audit world. After 20 years of working with people implementing data analytics, I've realized that I was wrong, that not everyone could or would use data analytics tools, and that each organization would have a different way of addressing the requirement of formalizing data analytics. One of the key changes over the last 20 years is that data analytics has now become a practice in its own right. It's become a field of competency. Whereas 20 years ago it was very much wild. People used whatever tools they wanted. There were lack of integration with the IT departments. Everything did not work smoothly, and people had lots of problems with data integrity. However, now that people have become data analysts, and not only do I run into them on airplanes, but which was really something exciting, except for the people around us, but it also led me to realize that it needed some formalization, and that different organizations responded differently to the challenges of implementing data analytics. I found roughly 4 models of how people would do that, and there are hybrids of those 4 models. That we will be considering, and also the various considerations that are important for integrating data analytics into your team. Several auditors and analysts contributed to this presentation by sharing their experiences, and I'd like to thank them in advance for their support. We'll take a look at the 4 models in detail, and then provide you with food for thought about each model and what considerations are important in ensuring its success. And then we'll take a look at what works best, what may work best for your organization, how to determine what would be the best fit for your organization. So please feel free to ask questions at any time. Very happy to respond to you as quickly as possible. First question was, why does data analytics need formalizing? Well, it's a fad, not a fad, and it's not going away. Someone actually once said to me, when will this data analytics thing be over so we can get back to audit? And I just looked at him and said, well, it's something that we all have to do. It's not a choice, it's a requirement. And so it's something that really needs to be integrated fully into audit, and we're seeing more and more organizations taking that into consideration. Data is the key part of the audit environment. Without the data, there's nowhere to go, really. You have no evidence for your findings, no support for your recommendations, and no understanding of what the bigger picture is. There are also multiple and massive data sets in every organization. Over the last 30, 40 years, we've seen a lot of consolidation in various industries, whether it's banking, food production, retail, and so on. And so you're having multiple data sets within one organization, which is something I've encountered several times in my work. And you also have data sets that are incompatible, so the interface between them requires transforming one set of data into another so that it matches what the rest of the organization is using. So these different formats also create their own challenges. There's also high-speed, high-volume transactions. If you just want to consider an environment like PayPal with millions of transactions per day at as fast as light. And there's also a lot of pressure to perform. Every single department in every organization I've spoken to is under pressure to perform. Taking all those into consideration, the best way to approach those is to take a strategic approach to data analytics to integrate it into your organization. Let's take a look at the four models. The first is the one I call internal and dispersed/distributed. That's where individual auditors manage their own tools and procedures. It's really the Wild West, and it's a model that worked back 20 years ago because there was no formal recognition of the need for data analytics. But as people are looking for efficiencies, they realize that it might be better to not have 5 or 6 people all trying to access the same database at the same time, so that some organization and structure was required. The second one is the internal and centralized dedicated team. That's where data analytics was recognized as a distinct competency with formal procedures and policies and processes. And this model is an effort to really gain some control over the management of data analytics. I can remember many IT departments rolling their eyes when we said that we needed access to the data. They said, well, how many of you are going to be looking for this access? What are you going to be doing with the data, and so on? If you have a team-based approach to data analytics, then you're more likely to develop a process that will make sure that there aren't too many demands on the system. Other organizations internally outsource their data analytics. They have a common data analytics team that conducts data analytics for the entire organization, and it's outsourced to them. This works if it's not a heavily data-driven organization. But there are problems with that model that we'll look at later. And then finally, there's the outsourced model. Some teams actually outsource their entire audit function. Others outsource just the data analytics. So you provide, the external data analyst will provide the results to the audit team, which will run off and do their research based on the results that were given. Again, that's a good model if you have a high turnover in your department, and that's one area where structure and organization really pay off. If you're ready to receive the data, then you're in good shape. And we've had several successful stories with this. We've had organizations where they've consistently relied on that for many years, and they build a good rapport with the external team. And as such, the external team becomes an informal part of their internal team. What are some of the key considerations when you're looking at integrating data analytics? Well, first is Strategic value perception. Does the audit leadership, the audit committee, all the key players, do they see data analytics as a strategic value? This was a hard sell many years ago, but now more and more people understand it because they've read more about it, they've heard more about data analytics, and it's not as much a mysterious or occult practice. It's become something that everyone does every day. And second, because internal auditors are becoming better at selling data analytics, by pointing out the key benefits. Other things to look at are data analytics tools. What sort of tools do you want to use? What are the pluses and minuses of the tools that are available to use? Accountability. How can you make sure that there's accountability for data analytics? Is it just do it whenever you can, or simply an informal accountability, or is it structured and incorporated into people's performance measurements? Resourcing is always an issue. I've noticed that many audit departments now have become a way station for many people on their way to other positions in the organization. So you might have the core of auditors who see it as a career and people rotating in and out of departments. So this can make it challenging for continuity and for the maintaining of the organization's institutional memory. It also there's realize that there's a huge amount of competition for resources. So the data analysts, rather than being embedded in a team for several years, now might join for a year or two and then move on to something else. And this can have an impact on accountability and continuity. Data management. Data is something that needs to be managed. You've got very confidential data that needs to be treated differently. And how do you manage that data? Do you just allow people to put it on their laptops? Do you have a node or part of a network that you can use that's dedicated for internal audit? And second, how do you make sure that you've got validation of the data before you use it? And finally, cost, that thing that we're all familiar with. People always wonder, what's the cost of implementing data analytics? And is there some way to measure the impact of data analytics? Finally, documentation. Documentation is something that's often overlooked. We've all been party to an event where something needs to be implemented and the key deliverable is to get it out the door as soon as possible, and we'll take care of the documentation later. There are several documents that are key to successful management of data analytics, and we'll take a look at what some of those documents are. And finally, data integrity verification. There's an assumption that if I pulled it out of the Oracle system or the SAP system that the data is correct, that there aren't any issues with the data. What a lot of people don't realize is that the data is processed. Simply the act of selecting data and taking a copy of it and downloading it to your machine or to your network can induce some errors into the data. And so make sure that teams have considered data integrity verification as part of their overall data management. Metrics. How do you measure the success of the individuals and the team who are implementing data analytics? If you've gone out and spent $50,000 on implementing a tool and the training and the network that you need to support the data, how do you analyze the benefits? Strategic value. In the first model we looked at, the strategic value is low because the cost and the effect and the management of data analytics is commingled with everything else that auditors do. It's not visible, it's not distinct necessarily, unless people care about it at the high level. When you have an internal team that's centralized and dedicated, the second model, it's distinct. You can track the costs, you can track what they're doing, you can track the deliverables. If it's internally sourced, then it's low to medium strategic value perception. The entire organization may recognize the strategic value, but in terms of internal audit, it's not really noticed because it's a cost that's outside your department. And the fourth model, where it's outsourced or co-sourced, it's a line item. You know how much you're going to pay for that expertise every year, but do you track it? So do the key players in the organization understand the value and the potential of data analytics? That's where you need to look at the chief audit executive, the audit committee. Have they implemented, for instance, the right of data access in the audit charter? A lot of teams aren't aware that it's a good idea to have the right of data access in writing, in essence, in the audit charter, so that if worse comes to worse, you can always waive that at somebody to make sure that you have access to the data. Understandably, the IT teams are very protective of their data, and that's their job after all, part of their job. But at the same time, you do need access to the data in order to execute your analytics properly. And the business and tech leadership. One of the auditors I worked with recently said, how do I talk to the tech people? The IT department just, their eyes glaze over when I talk about audit and why we need the data. And I realized that one of the most successful internal audit leaders for data analytics had a background in IT. And she was able to speak the language of the tech team. She could put it in terms that made sense to them and that had value to them. For the business, when they saw the results, they were often impressed. Oh, we didn't know that data was available, or we didn't know you could do that with the data, or we didn't know you could build continuous monitoring tools to help us make sure that the first line of defense is always strong. So these are the key players that you need to play with to ensure that data analytics are valued. What are the tools? Well, there's been a huge growth in the number of tools that are available out there. You know, in the past, it was just, Excel, somebody using FoxPro, which is an old database, or Microsoft Access. And then way over in the IT department, you had people who were using things like SQL or other obscure tools. However, in the last 10 years, I'd say there's been an explosion of data analytics tools that can be used. In the internal and dispersed model, you found people using multiple tools. While they're probably choosing the best tool for the occasion, there was a lack of consistency. If you've got an internal centralized team, then you can impose the use of a single tool or a few key tools rather than having everyone go Wild West on you and choose whatever tool they want to use. This is important for continuity purposes. If you have someone who's using Access, for instance, as their tool and they leave the organization, you'll be forced more or less to hire somebody else who knows Access to replace them in order to maintain continuity of what they're doing. One team I worked with recognized this early on. They brought me on board to convert all their SQL queries into an Arbutus or ACL script. And they said, yeah, we've had trouble making sure that the people who use SQL are good at their jobs because there was no standard at the time. And they said, we realized that it's much easier to track what we do and to have accountability if they're using a tool like ACL or Arbutus that has an audit log and an audit trail. When it's internally sourced, it's out of your hands. You've got this IT team or a data management team or a big data team running whatever tools they use to provide you with the data. Again, there's a lack of control there and a lack of accountability, and you're hoping that they've understood your request and executed accordingly. When you outsource or co-source, it's usually one or two key tools. Data analysts tend to favor one tool over the others, and you'll find them using that regardless of its drawbacks or its weaknesses. So you have to ask yourself, are our tools the best fit for our needs? What are our key needs? If we have no problems with data access, then yes, we can use tool A. If we have issues with data access and data integrity, we need something that can address those challenges. So you want to look for powerful analytic capabilities. Preferably something that you don't need to structure from day one to build them in, for instance, with say SQL, where you need to write the new capabilities every time. You need to be able to read data from multi-source data formats and types. There are companies now with operations in China, Latin America, Africa, and the Middle East. They're getting data in lots of different formats, lots of different types. So can your tool address those? The fewer times the data is processed or converted, the better. And so you'd like to have a tool that can read data natively. Is user training and support available? Right now, we're finding lots of training out there for all sorts of tools. As data analytics has grown into a profession on its own, we're finding more and more things available on the net, downloads, and support. Ideally, your tool will be read-only. I've had people persist with using tools like Excel where the data is in the clear, and that opens up the data to inadvertent or deliberate manipulation, deletion, and reconstructing of the data. If you have a read-only tool, it can't convert the original data. It can act on it and create a copy of it and convert that data, but it cannot do anything with the original data. So you have a clear audit trail from what you've executed all the way back to the source data. And if you use a tool that's read-only, then you have a lot of confidence in your results. I remember in one of the early audits I did back when I was an auditor, I used a tool that wasn't read-only, and I inadvertently hit the wrong key, and my data disappeared. So I tried to reconstruct it rather than going back to the original data, and I reconstructed it badly, and the results were embarrassing. That might be one of the reasons I switched into data analytics, but it's important to have a tool where you have confidence in the data. And ideally, you'd have an execution log as an audit trail. If you're being challenged on your findings, you need to be able to show a direct line from the data to your results. And you also need a scheduling or continuous capability. If you've got areas of high risk where the controls are very, very weak, it's ideal to set up continuous auditing capabilities so that you can address the risks on a timely basis rather than waiting for a month to pass or the next quarter. Continuous auditing, if it's enabled, can provide you with up-to-the-moment information about the risks you're facing. Accountability. Yep, if it's an internal team or it's dispersed, you've got accountability, but really only as auditors, unless you've implemented some very clear metrics. When you have a team that's centralized and dedicated, you can implement clear and distinct accountabilities. If it's internally sourced, that's not very consistent that you would have accountability. If you're outsourcing it to another department internally, then you're at their mercy. If it's outsourced or co-sourced to an external party, then yes, you can ensure that there's accountability by making it an item in the contract itself and protecting yourself. So are the users accountable? Is there a direct line between the individual analysts and their output? Is there an audit trail, for instance, that indicates that they've executed as needed? So you can make this accountability a metric in their evaluation. For resources, in the internal distributed model, yes, you've got resources, but only as auditors. You might have some accountability for data analytics, but it might be minor or informal or unstructured. If you have an internal and centralized team, you can implement clear and distinct skills and deliverables. You can ensure that they've conducted training, that they've attended some training. You can make sure that they're maintaining an audit trail, that they aren't just taking the data from the tool of choice, exporting it to Excel, and continuing their analysis there instead of continuing it in the team tool. If it's internal, you're not sure what resources are working on your data. You might not have a close enough relationship to be able to evaluate that. If you're outsourcing or co-sourcing, you can implement that in your contract. You can make sure that, for instance, the resource you'll be dealing with has so many years of experience in using that tool. So ask yourself, do we have the skills we need? Is there formal training and coaching available? Are we willing to invest in that? So that's one of the challenges when you have an audit department where people rotate in and out. You might spend a few $1,000s on training them, and 2 years later they're gone. You need to bring in more people on board. You can either hire somebody experienced who will cost more, or bring in somebody new and put them through the training and coaching again. So we find that it's a very high priority is to specifically include that in the job description evaluations. You want to look for a depth and breadth of experience. If I look at somebody's resume, and I've had to do that several times when evaluating candidates for other companies, I look for a depth and breadth of experience. For instance, if they've only worked with one tool, then that's an indication that they weren't too interested in pursuing other tools. If they have very narrow experience in applications, for instance, just AP audits, for instance, then I'd worry that they didn't have enough experience to really branch out into other fields of audit and apply the data analytics principles. So how do you identify these resources? Pick out the best. Well, you look for previous experience. Have they used tools like Arbutus, ACL, IDEA, SQL, VBA, Access, and so forth? Math majors are an interesting source of people who are very useful in internal audit, in implementing data analytics. Because math majors are taught to be logical, they make the transition to data analytics very readily. This was a big surprise, but a good one, because it indicates that the potential pool of resources is not as narrow as we thought. So look for math majors. They're very logical people. They're used to the rigor of mathematics. And I was very pleased when a new hire a few years ago, I was talking with her about finding outliers that were 2 standard deviations above the mean. She immediately came up with the formula. And I said, how did you know that? She said, well, this is what I do. I'm a math major. And she was right. And because of the rigor of logic in her experience, she was able to make the transition to the rigor of logic as far as projects and products and projects went. Actuaries are also a very good source. These are people who deal with cause and effect. They say, okay, what's the population looking like? Why? Why is it that we have people in this cohort, for instance, dying of these diseases rather than others? It can be a gloomy profession, and sometimes you'll find actuaries eager to make the move into data analytics. So there's a lot of people out there, and it may surprise you sometimes where they come from. So I was used to looking for people with previous experience in the data analytics tools, yet considering math majors and actuaries has really broadened my conception of what can make a successful data analyst. When I started in this business, finance and audit domain expertise would probably have been about 80–85%. But now that you have this vast panoply of data tools to use and reporting requirements, we're seeing more and more people in the data acquisition and manipulation area finding that as their capability, as a core capability. So I'm very glad to see that. And visual reporting techniques are also making headway. There are lots of nice tools out there like Tableau and Power BI and so forth that are coming into mainstream use, and more audit departments are starting to use them in order to present their results. Those tools are great because you can put them to a web page and have people filter the data and look at it to their heart's content without disturbing the actual output from the audit. So the trends are very positive. I'm glad to see that there's more and more interest in statistical techniques and data manipulation, and we're seeing the impact there of the development of data analytics as a core competency for individuals and for teams. So it's progress. Let's get the data acquisition and manipulation up there. Speaking of data management. This is a key issue. A lot of people don't realize how challenging it can be to manage your data. If you've got an internal and dispersed and distributed team, it's possible to have effective data management, but the oversight tends to be weak. The one team I worked with said, well, everybody owns data management, which to me means nobody owns it because nobody's accountable. Where you have an internal, centralized, or dedicated team, it's much easier and to implement and maintain very strong data management of the systems and of the data going in and out. When it's internally sourced, you're at the mercy of the providing department. How they manage the data is something that you can rely on, but once the data gets to you, you've still got the issue of how do I manage this data that I'm receiving. When outsourcing or co-sourcing, one of the weaknesses there is once you've outsourced or co-sourced, the data management is out of your control completely. It might be weak without having the proper safeguards. One of the best ways I've seen for people to manage outsourced or co-sourced teams is to provide them with remote desktop access to their system and to the data analytics tools and data, but only in that system. Exporting or copying of the data from their system to the user's computer is not permitted. So you've just got one way working where there's no flow of data across the network. It just stays locally in your organization's system. So that's a very powerful method. The least powerful is where somebody exports the data to Excel and emails it to somebody else. So there's about a dozen things wrong with that. And so the tighter the control over the data and the management of the data, the better, particularly if you're dealing with external parties. So do you have the right infrastructure and policies for managing your data? Do you have a network? Do you have a server? Is it a virtual server that's dedicated? Do you have policies and procedures built around the successful protection of that data? So when I joined the eBay team, before it split off into eBay and PayPal, we actually developed a dedicated server for internal audit and then the complete infrastructure. And we worked very closely with the IT team to implement that. It took about 9 months, but the result when we were done was something that matched exactly what we needed. We had good access to the data without interfering with production. We had a network where we could provide very high security for audit. We also had a very high security area within the audit for addressing very sensitive data, such as payroll. So we were very glad to have that set up, and it can be a challenge sometimes. You may get the question, well, why do you need a server? Well, we have lots of data. Well, can't you just delete it? Well, we need historical data. So you have to maintain the confidentiality and security of that data without compromising your ability to use it. That's where having a very structured team in terms of their access and their ability to read the data is very important, and ensuring that people with admin rights are limited. There was a tendency to quickly give admin rights to everybody so that everyone had administrator capabilities for managing the data. So in other words, everybody could do everything. And as time passed, you'll find that that's not the best way. It's best to have a few small teams looking at very specific data that's highly sensitive. And you need to provide yourself with independent access to the data. We were lucky that the teams at eBay and PayPal were able to build a pipeline directly into the databases so that we could pull data out independently. So this relieved them of several, the IT team relieved them of several burdens that they considered onerous and time-consuming, and allowed us to pull the data in a timely fashion. We could even structure continuous auditing capabilities because we have that independent access to the data. Of course, we had to be sure that our access was within the framework of the organization's data security policies. This was especially brought to light when there was the dedicated denial of service back in the WikiLeaks days, and the entire PayPal infrastructure came under attack. Cost, that's always the big one. Can we or should we identify the cost of data analytics? I think yes, you should identify the cost, but you have to make sure that you don't get caught into the ROI trap. If you have an internal and dispersed team, it's hard to identify the cost of data analytics apart from specific line items such as training or software purchases, because everything's diluted and commingled. If it's internal and centralized, dedicated, you can pinpoint the cost even down to the FTE level. You can say, fine, this FTE is responsible for 60% DA, 40% audit. So you can make a good judgment as to the cost. If it's internally sourced within your organization, it's hard to identify unless there's cost allocation. More and more departments, IT departments, are starting to allocate their costs to other departments. Again, during my time at eBay and PayPal, I was speaking with one of my coworkers in the IT team who provide us with data, and he said, we're doing our budget for next year. How much of my time do you think you'll need? And so that was the first time I'd ever been asked that. And so I said, well, let me come back to you with a number. And he said, yeah, because they need to know what kind of support they're providing to data analytics. I thought, oh, this is another cost of data analytics that can be lost in the larger organization scheme of things. And this is actually very useful because then we could point out that this is how much IT team hours we're saving by having independent access to the data. So the investment in the infrastructure to provide that independent access could be valued. We could put a number on it. When it's outsourced or co-sourced, you've got the contract cost. So that's your line item to identify the cost. So what are you looking at? Software, infrastructure, FTEs, training. That's the ROI question. How do we know how valuable our audits are? Well, the top line is the number of audits on which you're implementing data analytics. Are you making improvements in the scope and precision and efficiency? Are you being able to do more with the same number of people? Or does a 10% increase in your FTE cost yield a 20% increase in the number of audits you can work on? However, don't get caught in the trap of having to be very granular in terms of justifying the ROI. People used to say, well, what's the ROI of data analytics? I need to know. I need to have a very detailed costing and an expression of the return on investment. I said, well, that's like asking, what's the ROI of our AP department? You need to have AP. You need to have audit. You need to have financial reporting. And so really, it's not something you really need to defend at that level, at a very granular level. But at the high level, people like to see that you're doing more audits with greater scope and precision with the same or a modest increase in the FTEs. Documentation. What sort of documentation do you need to have? It's amazing how many teams don't document what they do. Again, with this internal dispersed team, it's challenging to implement. If you've got a centralized team, it's feasible. If you've got an internally sourced team, then it's not necessarily available. They might be able to provide you with the SQL query they use, but that'd be it. And if it's outsourced or co-sourced, you can make it part of the contract. We need documentation of this type. So top of the list is data dictionaries. Where's our data coming from? If you've got an Oracle set, is there a data dictionary for it so you know where to get the data you need? Do you have an audit planning document that highlights where the data and analytics are going to be implemented? Do you have a data request form? If an auditor comes to a data analyst on the audit team, how are they structuring their request? Is it formalized? And the more formalized, the better. If it's a client, then the client request form. And this is where ambiguity can come in. If you say, I want all the transactions up to April, well, what do you mean? Up to the end of March, up to the end of April, what kind of transactions, and so on. So the more precise your request can be, the better. And a process and script description. When you've completed the audit, how have you proceeded with the data analytics? What tools have you used, and what processes have you used? This is where the audit trail comes in handy. If you've got a log that has a date timestamp that tells you exactly what you've executed. An engagement checklist. If you're going into an engagement and DA is leading the charge, what do we need in advance? We need the data dictionary, so we need to have access to that data. Is that database off limits to us for any reason? The script execution log that we mentioned earlier. The deliverables and turnover document. This is very important because you want the person who's requested the data or the analytics to review what you've done and to certify that it is what they asked for. And a script library. Instead of reinventing the wheel every time, keep a library of your scripts so that when it comes time to re-execute, it's a straightforward matter. And post-execution, which used to be called post-mortem, but I prefer post-execution, you want to have us sit down and review, well, what did we do right? Did we do anything wrong? What were the highlights of this? Is there anything we can learn for future audits? So all this documentation is very, very useful in maintaining the institutional memory of the DA team in internal audit. Data integrity verification. This is one of my favorite topics because I found data integrity problems in all sorts of systems, from one of the world's largest banks to this small city in Northern California that was having problems with their data analytics. So if you've got an internal team that's dispersed, it can be challenging to maintain that discipline. If you've got a centralized team, it's feasible. If it's internally sourced, it's usually not available, but you can request it. If it's outsourced or co-sourced, you can request that they perform data integrity testing and include it in the contract. So what tests should be run? Well, you need to do it for due diligence to identify any possible data errors. I was working with a client and we pulled the data of customer transactions out of their system, and it didn't tie back to what was hitting the GL. The numbers were just slightly out of whack. It wasn't very material, but enough to make me concerned. And then it turned out that the customer transactions database also included internal transactions for some reason, and that there was a code that could exclude those, but nobody knew about it until we actually asked the question of why they were out of whack. There's also general tests you want to perform for data integrity testing to ensure that you're getting the right data and that it hasn't been corrupted in some ways. And there's also data-specific tests. Let's take a look at some of these. So someone says, well, what happens to data? Why should we check it to make sure it's consistent? We're just pulling it right from Oracle or SAP or whatever system you use. Well, here's one of my favorite similes. There's your raw data, and there's the data that you received. Well, what happened from left to right? Quite a bit can happen. So just consider your data is going through a process. Let's take a look at where corruption can happen. You send a request to somebody who executes that request. So you're assuming that they interpret your request the same way you wrote it. So unless it's in very unambiguous terms, not necessarily getting what might be asked. So that person will access the database and extract that data. So that extraction process and access process can also introduce sources of corruption. They extract that data usually to a spreadsheet or a delimited file and provide it to you. That's another step in processing. Something can happen when it goes from the database to the mode into which it's being presented to you. Often they'll zip it up, drop it on your server. Both of those processes are acting on the data. And then finally you download it to your machine and you start auditing. So all along this process, it's being handled. Handling anything can result in something going wrong. I've just been through a very frustrating experience where I've been ordering a glass shelf for my fridge. And it's been fine up until it reached Vancouver, and then both times that we ordered it, the shelf was broken. Why? Because something happened to it en route. Same thing happens to your data. So what are some of the tests you can run? Well, for numeric data, you can look for corruption. You'd like to look for field totals, the highest value, if it's sales, for instance, or items in the GL, and the second highest value. Some people say, why do you want to look at those? Well, that's a good way of finding out if you have one big outlier. You take the ratio of the second highest to the highest, and then you can see if that ratio goes the wrong way, it might indicate that your highest value could be an outlier. You'd also like to look at the lowest value. If it's a system that's not supposed to generate credits and you've got credits in there, something's wrong. What's your average to compare with historical averages? The range, the absolute value, the median, the number of zero entries. If you have $0 value entries on your GL, well, what's the point of that? How many positives you've got and how many negatives. And the standard deviation, again, to compare with historical data. For general tests, you'd like to look at date data. Is the date corrupted? What's the oldest date and what's the newest date? You want to make sure that the bounds of the data match what you requested or expected to receive. What's the span of that? If you've requested 1 year's worth of data and the span of the valid dates is more than 365, there's an issue. Are there transactions on weekends? This is where if you're auditing the GL and you're looking at manual journal entries, this is something you'd want to consider a bit of a high risk. Do you have blank dates where they should be populated? Do you have invalid non-blank dates? One company I worked with had a common spreadsheet they used for entering data. If you had Europeans entering the data, the dates came in one format. If you had North Americans entering the data, it came in another format for the dates. So you had no controls there over how the data was entered. If you're looking at character data, if it's supposed to be unique, like a unique transaction number or unique vendor number, check for non-blanks. If there's data that needs to be populated, such as addresses or bank information, are the entries valid? Is there a code in there that doesn't make sense? Is this country on the list of valid countries? Is it too short? Usually, addresses, for instance, have to have at least a couple of words. If you've got an address field that contains only 3 letters, that's something you've got to be concerned about. Are there non-printable characters? Non-printable characters are things like carriage returns and line feeds. There's a button you can press in your Word document to show you all the carriage returns and line feeds. Those can get into your data and cause corruption. Specific tests, are there logical relations between 2 fields? For instance, the invoice date and the purchase order date. You'd expect the purchase order date to be before the invoice date. Performing recalculations. Do I have valid patterns? If I have a phone number or a social security number, is it a valid pattern? Custom codes. If you have internal custom codes for products or divisions, you want to make sure those are valid as well. Record integrity. Is the same record being written twice my data? So is the record unique? Is the data shifting? So let's see what happens. You see down here in the last 3 items, the data has been pushed to the right, so the vendor name has been occurring in the invoice number column. Why? That's because there's a carriage return and line feed character in there that's been pushing your data out. So that data would not be very useful. So in terms of metrics, how do you evaluate your data analytics capability? Well, number of audits, the quality of the audits, the coverage, and the precision that you're generating, and consistency. All these are important for evaluating your capabilities. But it's important not to get too granular because then you get caught in what I call the ROI trap.
Bruno asked, are there any free data analytics tools out there?
That's a good question. A lot of people ask it. And yes, there are free tools out there. But like anything that's free, you have to watch out for getting what being sure that the tool you're using is valid and useful. I'd say that there aren't really any useful, good free data analytics tools out there. I haven't seen any. There are free ones, but they're not very good, and they're usually based on a platform such as SQL or Access, where they've used Visual Basic to hide what underlies the project, the tool. And the true cost of implementing a free tool is that you will pay for it on the way out, one way or another. So if it's free, it's probably worth every penny. So there's an evolution that's necessary of your data analytics capability. And people always say, what works best? And I always say, ask them, well, what's your organization like? And if they say, well, we have high turnover in internal audit, then that's something that might lead you to focus on developing a team that's committed to data analytics. If you have a team where people are accountable for data analytics, where their expertise is respected and valued, then you could work out having a committed data analytics team that will stay there regardless of the people rotating in and out of audit. So it's pretty straightforward to explain to data analytics how internal audit works. It doesn't necessarily work that well the other way around, so building a committed team might be your best bet. However, if you've got a lot of turnover and a reluctance to invest in terms of data analytic capability, then you'd want to go with the outsourced model. And the good thing is there are a lot of very good outsourcing resources available, where you can find a team that has a long history of expertise in data analytics and essentially buy their expertise. So you've got the internal model, and we looked at the centralized model. It's really what your organization is best suited to do. You might have two, for instance, banks, exactly the same size or similar, working in the similar areas, but they might have different profiles. One might be a bank that's very aggressive and looking to expand quickly. Another one might be one that's more or less happy with where they are and willing to continue. So each one would have a different need in terms of resourcing. Some people might be constrained by headcount, for instance, so you might want to look at the external model. The one I'd stay away from is the internally sourced model, because at some point you've got to have accountability. So I would go with 1, 2, or 4, but I'd try and stay away from number 3, because the accountability is the important thing. If something's gone wrong in your data analytics, you want to be sure that there's someone who you can deal with who will be able to address that issue. So it's an evolutionary process. It's not like buying a DA team off the shelf. You have to have an idea in mind for strategically where do you want to go with data analytics. You can use hybrid models. I've seen some teams where they've had a centralized dedicated team of data analysts, but each one was able to use their own tools. So having a dedicated team is great, because then you're making sure that data analytics is a capability that's distinct in your team. But if you're allowing people free rein to use the tools they're most comfortable with, then you have a hybrid of 1 and 2. Strong leadership is very important. You need to have someone who is committed to data analytics and willing to see it through the evolutionary process. If it's a careerist leadership where they're going to be out of there in a couple of years, then you may want to rethink what kind of audit team you want. And you've got to be able to attract and retain talent. If you're in an area that's very, very competitive, either a geographic area or a business area, you've got to be willing to pay up for that talent. So maybe starting out with outsourcing and then learning from that and slowly building an internal team might be the best way forward for you. And as I mentioned earlier, it's got to fit with your corporate culture. For instance, if you have a stack ranking, then you might have the audit teams internally competing with each other. If the corporate culture is not looking at stack ranking but looks at individual achievements and so forth, then you might want to look for a different model. Any questions?
Michael, we do have a couple of questions that came in. I know that we're a little bit past the time, so let me just give you one. When working in a highly decentralized organization, is it more effective to have multiple teams specializing in their segment's data, or a centralized team that handles the enterprise?
That's a very good question, and I would say having specialized teams is very useful, particularly if it's a large and complex organization. But the important thing there is to have adequate documentation, so that, let's say in the event of an emergency, a key person is out for some reason, and the only available resources on one of the other teams, they can use the documentation to quickly bring themselves up to speed. The data analytics practices they would bring are pretty generic, but in terms of knowing the kind of data that the other team was working with, that's where documentation really has a great value.
Excellent. I've got one more question here, and then we're going to have to close it off. For those questions that we can't get to, Arbutus and Michael will get a copy of those questions in the attendee report. What data analytic tool would you well, what are the top 3 statistical techniques mostly associated with data analysis?
Statistical techniques, that's where you'd want to apply them to look for outliers. And there are outliers of various types. They're not just financial outliers. They could be operational as well. So if you're looking at, let's say, transaction values, you'd want to pick up the outliers by looking for, there's a variety of ways to do that. You could look at the top quartile, which would give you the top 25% of the materiality. You could look at the standard deviation of the population and say, fine, I want to pick up the top 2.5% or so. So I want everything that's more than 2 standard deviations greater than the average. Other people have made a twist on that and used the median rather than the standard deviation and applied the median instead of the average, and apply the 2 standard deviations test to that. So there are lots of different ways you can look for outliers, and the longer you work with your data and you can identify what an outlier is for your organization, the better your results will be. The first to do it, if you look for things above 2 standard deviations, you might get too many. That way you know that you have to refine it and look for something more detailed. For instance, you might want to take the top 10% of the top 2.5%, and eventually you'll arrive at a number that can give you data you can work with where it won't be too onerous to follow up. The other techniques, you can look at clustering, for instance. Are there clusters? Is there a concentration of transactions in any one particular area? And lots of techniques, for instance, a lot of the tools out there will allow you to create visualizations that can show you a visual cluster in a geographic sense as well. So clustering is also a very good technique to use.
Okay, very good. Well, unfortunately we've run out of time, but I want to thank you all for joining us today and for the questions, and if we couldn't get to your questions, we will be sharing those with Arbutus and with Michael for follow-up after the webinar is over. We're glad you could join us and hope the session was helpful for you. Thank you, Michael, for your presentation and sharing your knowledge and experience on this topic. The purpose of our training is to provide high-quality training solutions as a benefit to subscribers and site license users, covering timely topics with value-added resources and tools that you can use in your job. We bring the world's best subject matter experts directly to your desktop with timely information. If you're not a current subscriber, please visit AuditNet for information on joining our community. There's information on our audit program templates, recorded training, and more available on AuditNet. Just a reminder, if you're viewing this session live, you will receive an evaluation form. Please take a few moments to complete it when it arrives. It will help us improve our webinars. If you'd like to view our other webinars on demand, we've partnered with C-Risk Academy, where you can view the webinars anytime and any place and earn CPE. Again, Michael's contact information is there. You can contact Michael directly. Also, we will share the attendee report with Arbutus, and they will have access to all of the questions that we couldn't get to. So, Michael, thank you very much. Appreciate your taking your time and sharing your knowledge and expertise with us, and thank you all for joining us today.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Have a great day, everyone. Bye.